Hi everyone, I'm Christoph. Great to have you all here after lunch and glad you made it. I'd like to discuss with you today some things about the impacts of growing Tor. That's because I think there might be some aspects that could be worth thinking about together, and yeah, I think we can do that here today. Yeah, it comes at no surprise that Tor is growing quite significantly, and it is going to continue that growth most probably. Just think of like the introduction of RT or trends to or considerations to introduce some kind of super private browsing modes in Firefox, etc. Yeah, in order to accommodate that user growth, Tor has to grow itself. So how does Tor grow? In general, of course, resources are donated by volunteers, and in doing so, it can either grow vertically, so there's more bandwidth per relay, or horizontally. So yeah, just a typical distinction as is done in other distributed systems. So in a recent paper, we analyzed and modeled these dimensions of growth. And again, we took like the number of relays and their average bandwidth as indicators for horizontal and vertical growth. In order to make that clearer, we analyzed that historical data a bit more rigorously. And what we did here is for each point in time, we compared the network state half a year before and after that time, giving us some kind of a rolling annual growth rate for each of the growth dimensions. And we can see here that indeed, of course, both growth dimensions have been relevant for Tor in the past, but they are, they somewhat took turns over phases in the past. So what does this mean for Tor? It just really means we have to deal with the fact that Tor is growing in both dimensions significantly. And that obviously creates some challenges. So for example, let's consider performance within Tor. So we might, for example, be afraid that there are potential performance issues like does load distribution still work as intended, or are there any new bottlenecks created, and so on. So, of course, performance is an issue in general when growing such systems, and one might discuss whether it's all right with Tor as is or not. But in fact, we showed in the aforementioned paper, where we also carried out some shadow simulations of upscaled Tor networks. And we saw that purely horizontal growth can actually lead to, or doesn't scale as well as purely vertical growth. So we think there might be some resource allocation effect or something like that. But it's probably something to be aware of. But what I'd really like to discuss focus on today is, what about anonymity? So the question really is, how does the provided anonymity change with the network size or topology? And to make that clear, I don't have a definite answer to that, but let me explain why I think it's worth discussing. In order to do so, let's briefly talk about Tor's adversary model. So the general assumption is that anonymity is trivially broken if both ends of a circuit can be monitored, either because the relays are adversarial or because there's some network adversary. If we now add resources, these can either be benign or malicious. So if we want to argue about the provided anonymity, this is a purely combinatorial argument. But let me argue that maybe this point of view isn't necessarily sufficient. And for that, let's have a look at what goes on in this case at the traffic. So the reason why this situation is so critical is obviously because the attacker can carry out traffic correlation. So both ends of the circuit log their traffic and correlate it. While in such a situation, the attack is certainly possible and absolutely real, it isn't actually completely trivial, as previous work has shown. So even if the attacker, of course, has a high success probability for the attack, the precise numbers depend quite a bit on some factors such as the number of circuits at these relays, etc. And to make this point a bit clearer, let's consider the extreme cases. So in the first example here, we have a single circuit that is the only one using the two relays. While in the second example, these relays are densely packed with circuits. And we argue that probably this makes some kind of a difference in costs for the adversary, be it observation time that's necessary to be certain of who's communicating with whom, or be it computational effort. Either way, the density within the network may make a difference, and that again depends on the growth direction. So we argue that it might be anonymity provided might actually depend on how Tor grows. While we really actually acknowledge that traffic analysis in this situation is of course real, and we're somewhat doomed in this case, we think that it's still reasonable to consider the costs such attacks require, because if, for example, we think of an NSA-style adversary who wants to carry out mass surveillance, so who aims at de-anonymizing all users, then costs do clearly make a difference. Okay, so in the end, we think that such effects should be considered when looking at Tor growth, but also, for example, when improving performance on the network. And I'd say that this aspect might maybe deserve some more research. But I'm very happy to hear from you what you think about that, whether you think it's relevant direction to look into, or whether maybe you have some arguments why it's completely irrelevant or doesn't work as explained. Okay, and with that, thanks a lot, and let's have a great discussion on that.
Thank you so much, Christoph. I don't see any question on the lip, but if you have some, feel free to write. It's still monitored. Otherwise, if people have a clarifying question in the room, maybe Christoph can answer them quickly, and then we can move towards a more open and heated, hot discussion. Is there any hands in the room? Yes.
I'm curious about your opinion on changes in the number of allowed relays per IP address. Does that affect any of, for example, correlation attacks?
Yeah, very interesting question. I think that's of course something to discuss again. I think it's some kind of orthogonal to what we're discussing here, because it probably doesn't really affect the topology of the network, but I still think that the limitations we have in place right now do somewhat make sense in order to avoid having too many relays put together very locally. But yeah, I don't actually have a strong opinion on that.
So we have a room full of people, some of whom work on this field. Does anyone else have an answer for David?
So yeah, the answer for David is all of these are complicated ones. So I noticed that you had relay adversaries as your focus, but you can also think about network adversaries, so ISPs that watch things, or Deutsche Telekom, and so on. And I mean, one of the many open research questions here, it's not just about the topology of the Tor network, it's the topology of the internet that you put it on. And so we have 7,000 relays spread around the world, but not uniformly around the world. Is 7,000 way more than we need to get some amount of coverage? If we doubled it to 14,000, would we improve the anonymity against a network level adversary? Or do we already have enough and we got enough at 2,000? This is one of the open research questions of how big you have to be before you've got coverage on the internet. And of course it gets much more complicated than that, because if I'm wondering about French intelligence, then adding more relays elsewhere is great, but adding more relays in Germany where the bandwidth is, if Germany is my attacker, is bad. So it gets complicated. But not just relay adversaries, also think about network adversaries.
Yeah. Actually, I think I thought I'd mentioned that, because I think maybe network adversaries are really a big point to focus on. And also I think at least this is our claim that it might get easier for network adversaries to attack Tor if the logical topology of the network changes in a way that single circuits are left more alone in the network, and so the traffic patterns get clearer because there's less distortion and so on. So yeah, these two are quite intervened. Yeah. Okay, so any more opinions on that in general? Okay, and then because what I was proposing here in the talk was the case of growing, but I think one thing we've also seen quite clearly over the past years is that Tor has been working very actively on improving performance in order to make usability better, attract more users, and so on. But I think the same argument we are putting forward here also actually applies for these approaches, be it KIST or whatever you name it, protocol improvements. And one might argue that if we improve performance too much, then maybe that like temporal relationship between data entering the network and data leaving the network becomes more direct. So maybe an adversary in any kind who does carry out traffic correlations can more easily do that. Yeah, what do you think? Is that something one should be aware of, or yeah, we don't really have a means of like putting that into precise arguments right now, but we still think it's worth like considering when it was growing further. Any opinions on that?
Can maybe add something quickly just before. I think there's an interesting parallel with other technologies like Signal versus Telegram, for instance, where Signal, I think, is a lot more conservative about adding features, because every small features you add is beneficial for the user, and scaling performance, scaling like in terms of usability can help. But it does come at a cost in terms of privacy, and it's something that is difficult, very difficult to explain to users, I think, often. But
Oh, that was never on? Okay. Sorry about that. Should I repeat everything? Or was I loud enough? Okay, good. A lot of practice lecturing in large halls. We have 500 students in Delft. So anyway, so the point was basically, I think you need to worry about better performance leading to better timing attacks. But on the other hand, let's start with, after we improve the performance, we can see how well performed is the system, and then we can always add more dummy traffic or more delays rather than staying with a system that is not well performing.
So I think Roger wants to respond immediately, and then we can go to the Zulip question.
So it might be better than that, because if you have a better performing system, you get more users. And you were talking about relays, but in terms of adding more users to the system, there's more flows that collide, and perhaps some of these website fingerprinting or end-to-end correlation attacks become harder. So it's a non-linear system where, yes, it becomes faster, but that accumulates more users, and therefore it's unclear whether the anonymity attacks become harder at scale or easier at scale. And go ahead.
Sorry, I just had one idea that even if the number of users grows, if we are getting much more performance, then maybe each user is only active for a shorter period of time. So maybe the flows actually start to collide even less again, because each transfer doesn't take like 2 seconds anymore, but only maybe half a second. So yeah, I really find it hard to like have an intuition on what's better, right?
Another piece of hard to have the intuition is, as we make things faster, are we making the end-to-end correlation attacks going from 99% successful to 98% successful? Or are we making them go from 2% successful to 1%? Or is it 99 to 1? Because living in different worlds really changes things.
And remember, the web gets bigger all the time, so the things you're downloading through the network are also changing.
We have a Zulip question.
Yes, we have also a comment from Jan Golver who asks, please people use the mic in the room. And another question from Jan Dissim asking, now that Tor is rolling out Conflux, where a single circuit might traverse multiple paths at the same time, how is Conflux going to affect horizontal and vertical scaling in terms both of anonymity and performance? If someone wants to answer this.
You don't have to answer all of the questions.
Yeah. So anyone? Actually don't know too much about Conflux, so I can't really,
Yeah, so the Conflux, Nope, you do it, Rob. It's you. I'll answer the first part, you answer the second part. So the Conflux design is, it's a way that a Tor client can build two paths in parallel that end at the same exit relay. And then you get better performance because you've got multiple paths. You get maybe better resilience because if one of them dies, then the other one keeps going. Maybe you're better against some attacks because if one of them gets blocked, the other one continues to work. Maybe you can get better performance because you can load balance more on the one that's giving you better end-to-end latency. So that's the design. Up to you, Rob, for the analysis of what that does to privacy.
Well, you're building more circuits, so there's some resource usage there on top of a single circuit. In terms of anonymity and performance, or of scaling, I don't know what else it does for scaling. It's not going to, that doesn't get you additional relays. It's just a different way of sending your traffic through the network. So I think it's orthogonal. But the presenter should offer their opinion.
Yeah, so as I said, without being too deep in that, my intuition again is that maybe it doesn't make a huge difference in terms of anonymity, because if some attacker has that end-to-end view, either by observing your local ISP and the exit or whatever, then it probably doesn't make that much of a difference, I'd say. Yeah.
Hi.
So, yeah. Sorry. Was there any?
Oh, hi. Most of the time I think that like this is kind of an all knowledge is worth having thing, but one thing I worry a little bit about when I think about like whether I should work on this, for example, is like the trying to understand end-to-end correlation attacks. I think there might be a possibility of like actually coming up with advances that actually make the attacks much better than and more efficient for adversaries than whatever they might currently be doing. And I mean, to what a degree do we think like, you know, if we're sort of on the side of anonymity, that's a thing that it's better to understand and better to have the understanding by doing those things versus potentially maybe not.
Great question to bring up with 2 minutes left. It's a big one, yeah?
So the thing I was thinking about is that it's nice to discover any vulnerability in your software, because it's better if we are the one that discover that and let the vendor know, because there are people maintaining tools. So if you discover some issues with tool or discover some software, just let that person know. And once we fix that, you can just publish your paper, and there will be no adverse consequence unless the sensor is just recording all the traffic all the time. Over.
I think Luke is closer to you.
Christoph, maybe for you. I mean, maybe like today, very easily without doing a lot of like advanced network research, we could just ship an ad blocker with Tor browser and reduce the page load time by 35% according to my measurements. Network bandwidth usage a lot. People will be happier. Will use more. Will use Tor more. Why not?
That sounds great, because I think the key really is to some degree how much traffic does a user generate, because the more traffic we use through a circuit, the more possibilities there are for correlating and also just putting less pressure on the network.
Can the next speaker come and set up? I cannot find you. Good. Can you come set up? And then your question can last as long as he's not set up yet.
Okay, thanks. Since you've been looking at relays and maybe relay diversity, are you aware of any terminology or taxonomy or whatever that could describe like a score, like a diversity score for the relay? Like, are they in the same country, that is legal jurisdiction? Are they run under the same ISP? Are they sitting on the same first hopper outer? Are they sitting on the same switch? These are all things. Are they sitting in the same data center? These are all places where at least passive attacks are relatively, straightforward to perform. And it is interesting to see, it would be interesting to see what kind of diversity we have on all of these different measures. And in the future, we might be able to have the client actually weigh relays when it should decide its 3 hops.
I mean, there has been a lot of research on tuning circuit selection in a way that takes into account autonomous systems and so on. But of course, many of those approaches also come at the risk at leaking information, for example, where you're located yourself and so on. So yeah, it's again not so easy.
Okay, let's wrap that up. Thank our speaker again.
Thank you, everyone.